in the vast reaches of the galaxy, where suns burn cold and life defies logic, there exists a myth among the stars. Creatures born on a planet so hostile, it makes war zones look like spas. These beings are called Death Worlders, and today, one just walked into Professor Vexar's classroom. Instructor Vexar, or Instructor Vexar, as his students not so secretly called him, stood before his class at the Galactic Academy of Advanced Species Studies, with what passed for a smug expression on this four-mandible face. "Welcome," he clicked, mandibles twitching in barely contained excitement, "to Survival Skills for Mixed Species, course code X475. The assembled students, a colorful collection of various galactic species, shifted nervously in their hover seats. There was the usual mix: 3 gelatinous gelleroids who changed colors with their moods, currently a nervous shade of puce, 4 insectoid Chictari with their ever-twitching antennae, 2 crystalline Crystari who sparkled under the classroom's soft bioluminescent lighting, and, wait, Instructor Vexar's compound eyes zoomed in with an audible whir. There in the back row, slouched in a reinforced seat, designed for species 3 times their mass, sat something he'd never seen before in his 200 cycles of teaching. A human, an actual real-life Death Worlder, by the sacred nebulae. He whispered to himself, mandibles clicking rapidly in agitation. The human, according to the registration form, one Axel Drake, was actually grinning. In a survival skills class, Instructor Vexar quickly regained his composure, straightening his ceremonial teaching sash. "As you all know," he continued, projecting his voice through his thoracic resonator, "this course is designed to prepare you for the dangers that lurk in our vast galaxy. From toxic atmospheres to high-gravity environments, from extreme temperatures to hazardous wildlife encounters." The gelleroids quivered anxiously, while the Chictari clicked their mandibles in nervous agreement. The human, was that a yawn? "We will start," Instructor Vexar announced, pulling up a holographic display, "with the most basic survival protocols. First, atmospheric containment breach procedures." He paused for dramatic effect. "Who can tell me the proper response to a Class 3 oxygen exposure?" Several appendages shot up, but Instructor Vexar's attention was drawn to the human, who had raised not just a hand, but also an eyebrow. "Yes, Mr. Drake?" "Just breathe normally," Jake suggested, struggling to keep a straight face. The class gasped in horror. One of the Crystari actually dimmed their bioluminescence in shock. "Mr. Drake," Instructor Vexar's mandibles clacked in disapproval, "this is precisely the kind of reckless attitude that makes this course essential. Oxygen is a highly reactive element that can cause rapid oxidation in most species." "Right. Sorry, Prof." Jake nodded, trying to look serious but failing miserably. "I forgot that not everyone comes from a planet that's basically marinating in the stuff." Instructor Vexar felt his thoracic cavity constrict slightly. This was going to be a very, very long semester. He had prepared for every possible scenario in his survival course, except apparently for a student who came from a planet that most species considered uninhabitable. "Well then," he clicked, pulling up the next holographic slide, "let us proceed with the basics of pressure suit maintenance. And Mr. Drake, please try to contain your enthusiasm for potentially lethal situations." The human's response was a thumbs-up gesture that somehow managed to seem both respectful and deeply amused at the same time. "Today's practical exercise," Instructor Vexar announced, his mandibles twitching with professional pride, "will demonstrate proper safety protocols for what we call extreme environmental conditions. He gestured toward the Academy's state-of-the-art simulation chamber, which currently displayed warning holograms in 17 different languages. Jake Drake, slouched against the back wall, was already biting his lip to keep from laughing. The warning signs included helpful messages like, "Danger, temperatures may fluctuate up to 5 degrees," and, "Warning, surface may be slightly uneven." "Now, students," Instructor Vexar continued, activating his protective field, "observe as I demonstrate the proper technique for handling what we call a weather event." The simulation chamber hummed to life, generating what the system claimed was dangerous wind conditions. To the assembled alien students, the gentle breeze that stirred their various appendages might as well have been a Category 5 hurricane. The Gelleroids immediately formed protective spheres, while the Chictari locked their exoskeletons into emergency position. "Notice how I maintain my stabilizing field," Instructor Vexar shouted over the whisper of moving air, "and keep my center of gravity low." He was practically crawling across the floor, his 4 legs spread wide for maximum stability. Jake couldn't help it. He snorted loudly. Instructor Vexar's head swiveled 180 degrees to fix him with a stern, compound-eyed stare. "Perhaps, Mr. Drake, you would care to demonstrate the proper technique." "Sure thing, Prof." Jake pushed off from the wall, strolling casually into the simulation chamber. The wind barely ruffled his hair. "So, what exactly am I supposed to be worried about here?" "Mr. Drake, activate your protective field immediately." "Don't have one," Jake shrugged, doing a little spin in the breeze. "Never needed one back home. This is actually kind of nice. Reminds me of spring break in Chicago." The Cristari were flickering in distress, their crystalline forms vibrating with concern for their classmates' safety. One of the Gelleroids had fainted, forming a small puddle. "Very well." Instructor Vexar clicked, mandibles tight with annoyance. "Let's proceed to the next simulation. Computer, activate terrain hazard course." The chamber floor morphed, creating what the system considered a treacherous obstacle course. To Jake, it looked like a slightly bumpy sidewalk. "Students, observe the proper technique for navigating unstable terrain." Instructor Vexar began a painfully slow demonstration of the safe crossing method involving radiation scanners, stability probes, and something that looked suspiciously like a very high-tech walking stick. That's when everything went wrong. One of the Chictari, attempting to follow the professor's example, accidentally activated their defense mechanism, releasing a cloud of calming pheromones. This caused the nearest Gelleroid to expand rapidly, bouncing off the chamber walls like a sentient rubber ball. In their panic, the Cristari began emitting emergency strobe patterns, turning the entire chamber into an impromptu disco. "Remain calm," Instructor Vexar shouted, his own protective field malfunctioning in the chaos. "Remember your emergency protocols." Jake, watching the increasingly ridiculous scene unfold, decided it was time to help. Without activating a single safety device, he jogged across the treacherous terrain, caught the bouncing Gelleroid with one hand. They were surprisingly light, used his free arm to steady Instructor Vexar, and managed to shield the nearest Chictari from the strobing lights with his body. "Everyone okay?" he asked cheerfully, still holding the gently quivering Gelleroid. "Maybe we should take 5. The chamber fell silent, except for the soft whimper of malfunctioning safety equipment. Instructor Vexar's mandibles worked soundlessly for a moment before he managed to speak. "Mr. Drake, did you just traverse multiple hazard zones without any safety equipment?" "Oh, sorry about that," Jake replied, carefully setting down the Gelleroid, who had turned a fascinating shade of grateful purple. Force of habit. Back home, we call this kind of thing walking. Walking, Instructor Vexar repeated faintly. Yeah. Though honestly, this floor is pretty smooth compared to Michigan sidewalks in winter. Jake paused, noticing the stunned silence. Should I not have mentioned that? Professor K's answer was to activate the emergency class dismissal signal. As the students filed out, the Chictari still clicking nervously, the Cristari dimmed to an embarrassed glow, and the Galaroids leaving small trails of anxious moisture, he began furiously updating his lesson plans. Clearly, the standard extreme conditions curriculum needed some serious revision, and possibly a new definition of the word extreme. Today's exercise, Instructor Vexar announced with what he hoped was appropriate gravitas, will test your ability to navigate vertical obstacles under varying gravitational conditions. He gestured proudly at the Academy's newest training wall, a smooth 30-foot surface dotted with standard magnetic anchor points. The class huddled at the base, each student wrapped in enough safety equipment to survive a small supernova. Well, almost each student. Mr. Drake, Instructor Vexar's mandibles clicked rapidly in exasperation. Where is your gravitational compensation harness? Jake glanced up from where he'd been examining the wall's surface. Oh, right. It kind of broke. Broke? Instructor Vexar's voice rose an octave. How does a military-grade grav-comp harness just break? Well, Jake scratched his head sheepishly. I tried adjusting it to Earth normal gravity, and it sort of melted. Before Instructor Vexar could process this disturbing information, the first student began their climb. The Cristari moved gracefully, their crystalline form glinting as they activated each magnetic anchor point. The Galaroids followed, stretching their amorphous bodies between secure points with methodical precision. Then the Chictari attempted their ascent. That's when everything went sideways. Literally, a sudden power fluctuation caused the wall's gravity field to hiccup. The Chictari, halfway up, let out a high-pitched chirp of alarm as their magnetic anchors failed. The Cristari's crystal structure began resonating with the malfunctioning gravity field, creating a harmonic cascade that disrupted everyone's safety systems. "Emergency protocols!" Instructor Vexar shouted, his own gravity stabilizers sparking uselessly. "Activate your emergency." Oh no. The wall's gravity field was cycling wildly now. Students clung to their anchor points as the pull shifted from floor to ceiling to walls, their safety equipment trying desperately to compensate. One of the Galaroids had stretched into a panic-induced pretzel shape. "Hang on!" Jake called out, already moving. Before Instructor Vexar could stop him, not that he could have given that he was currently floating sideways, the human launched himself at the wall. What followed defied several laws of physics and most of Instructor Vexar's understanding of xenobiology. Jake bounced off the wall, pushed off a protruding anchor point, twisted in midair, caught a falling Chictari with one arm, planted his feet against the ceiling during a gravity shift, and somehow used the momentum to springboard toward the main control panel. "Just gotta," Jake grunted, stretching out with his free hand while holding both himself and the trembling Chictari steady with the other. His fingers found the emergency shutdown, and with a final flip that made Instructor Vexar's compound eyes spin, he slapped the button. The gravity field normalized with a gentle whump. Everyone settled back to the floor, some more gracefully than others. The Galaroid untwisted themselves with the embarrassed little plop. "Is everyone okay?" Jake asked, carefully setting down the shell-shocked Chictari. "That was kind of fun, actually. Reminded me of that parkour gym back in Portland. Fun? Squeaked one of the Crystari, their crystal structure still vibrating with residual shock. You call that fun? Well, yeah, Jake grinned, though usually I have more walls to work with, and music. Music really helps with the flow, you know. Instructor Vexar, who had finally managed to right himself, stared at his human student with a mixture of horror and fascination. "Mr. Drake," he said carefully, "are you telling me that your species does this sort of thing recreationally?" "Oh, sure. Well, not exactly this. Usually there's more flips, and sometimes we do it on buildings, though that's kind of frowned upon in most cities." Jake paused, noticing the stunned silence that had fallen over the class. "I should probably stop talking now, shouldn't I?" Instructor Vexar's only response was to mark vertical navigation as pending curriculum revision in his teaching notes, right below weather survival and terrain traversal. The Chiktari Jake had caught was still staring at him with a mixture of terror and awe, antennae twitching in what might have been admiration or post-traumatic stress. Possibly both. "Welcome to Hazardous Material Safety Protocol," Instructor Vexar announced, his mandibles clicking with renewed determination. The chemical lab sparkled with cutting-edge containment fields and emergency purification systems. Surely, he thought, today would be the day his human student showed proper respect for danger. Axel Drake was eating a sandwich. "Mr. Drake," Instructor Vexar's voice cracked, like a static discharge. "No consumption of sustenance in the chemical laboratory. The atmospheric particulates alone could be lethal." "Oh, sorry, Prof." Jake quickly wrapped up his lunch. Force of habit. Used to eat in the chem lab all the time during college. Our professor just made us wear goggles. One of the Gelleroids rippled in horror, their surface turning a sickly chartreuse. The Crystari dimmed their bioluminescence in shared dismay. "Today," Instructor Vexar continued, trying to ignore the casual mention of such reckless behavior, "we will be learning about proper handling of Class 3 corrosive substances." He gestured to a sealed container floating in a triple-layer containment field. "This is a sample of dihydrogen monoxide in its liquid state." The class gasped appropriately. The Chiktari's antennae curled in terror. Jake raised his hand. Prof, that's water?" "Yes, Mr. Drake." Instructor Vexar clicked impatiently. "A highly dangerous polar solvent, capable of dissolving numerous compounds. Observe the proper handling technique." What followed was an elaborate demonstration involving quantum seal gloves, molecular barriers, and enough warning signs to fill a small library. Instructor Vexar carefully transferred a single drop of the liquid to a test surface, narrating each safety measure in detail. That's when the lab's atmospheric sensor hiccuped. Red warning lights flashed as the system detected trace amounts of carbon dioxide in the air. The automatic purification system engaged, creating a swirling vortex of competing air currents. Unfortunately, it also disrupted the containment field around several other samples. "Emergency protocols!" Instructor Vexar shouted as various sealed containers began to wobble. "Activate your personal shields. Evacuate in an orderly—" Jake was already moving. Without activating a single safety measure, he caught 3 falling containers of lethal substances, managed to stabilize a rack of highly volatile compounds with his elbow, and used his foot to kick a rolling vial of extremely dangerous solution back onto its shelf. The class watched in horror as drops of various liquids splashed onto his exposed skin. "Jake!" screamed a Crystari, their crystal structure practically strobing with panic. "The acid! The terrible acid!" Jake glanced at his arm where a drop of liquid was slowly rolling down. "Oh, this? Nah, it's just vinegar. Smells like my mom's pickle recipe, actually." He sniffed, appreciatively. Though she uses more dill. Instructor Vexar's compound eyes were rotating independently now, a sure sign of extreme stress. Mr. Drake, you've just been exposed to enough corrosive material to dissolve a small spacecraft. Really? Jake looked genuinely surprised. Huh. Well, I guess that explains why it's kind of tingly, like those face masks my sister uses. He paused thoughtfully. Actually, do you mind if I take a sample? She'd probably love to try this stuff. The Gelleroids had merged into a single mass of anxiety. The Zizik were producing distress pheromones at an alarming rate. Even the usually stoic Cristari were flickering like broken festival lights. Instructor Vexar moved with shaking appendages to check the chemical analysis display. His mandibles dropped open in shock. According to the readings, the human's epidermis was actually neutralizing the corrosive compounds. Through some impossible biological process, Jake's skin was rendering laboratory-grade acids about as dangerous as, well, as face cream. This is impossible, Instructor Vexar muttered, refreshing the display. The chemical resistance readings, the metabolic adaptations. What kind of evolutionary pressure creates something like this? Oh, Earth stuff is way worse than this, Jake said, setting the sealed containers down carefully as the safety field re-engaged. You should see some of the hot sauces we put on our food. There's this one called Death's Last Regret that actually made my cousin cry. Good flavor, though. Instructor Vexar's professional composure finally cracked. Your species voluntarily consumes corrosive substances for pleasure. Well, yeah, grinned. Gives the food a nice kick. Though Mom says I need to cut back since I got heartburn last week. The last straw was Jake pretended to lick a drop of liquid, then laughed. Just kidding, Prof. Definitely vinegar, he confirmed, as Instructor Vexar's exoskeleton made an ominous creaking sound. But like the cheap kind, not as good as Mom's. The chemical safety portion of the curriculum was officially suspended, pending a complete review of what exactly constituted dangerous when a Death Worlder was involved. Instructor Vexar stood before his class, mandibles set in grim determination. After weeks of increasingly chaotic lessons, he had prepared what he called the ultimate survival challenge. The simulation chamber had been programmed with every possible hazard: unstable gravity, atmospheric anomalies, temperature fluctuations, and even mild precipitation. "Students," he announced, "today's final exam will test everything you've learned. And yes, Mr. Drake, you must wear the safety equipment this time." Jake, now wrapped in enough protective gear to make him look like a chrome-plated marshmallow, gave a thumbs up. "Looking good, Prof. Though this suit's actually pretty cozy. Reminds me of winter camping in Minnesota." The Cristari exchanged worried glances, their crystalline forms dimming at the casual mention of winter, a concept that still gave them nightmares. "Begin simulation," Instructor Vexar commanded, secretly activating his special protocols. If he couldn't get a proper reaction out of the human with standard hazards, well, perhaps a few accidental malfunctions would do the trick. The chamber transformed into what most species would consider a nightmare scenario. The gravity began shifting randomly. The temperature dropped 10 whole degrees. There was even a light drizzle. The alien students moved cautiously through the course, following their safety protocols to the letter. The Gelleroids formed a protective cluster. The Zizik moved in perfect synchronized formation, and the Cristari generated their defensive light fields. Then Instructor Vexar triggered the first malfunction. The gravity suddenly reversed. The temperature control accidentally went haywire. The sprinkler system mysteriously increased, to actual rain levels, and the ventilation system began pumping in trace amounts of horror of horrors, unfiltered oxygen. "Oh no," Instructor Vexer exclaimed with perhaps slightly too much drama. "Multiple system failures. Remain calm and activate emergency. Woohoo!" Jake's enthusiastic shout cut through the chaos. The human had somehow already shed half his safety gear and was he dancing? "This is awesome," Jake called out, executing a perfect backflip in the shifting gravity. "It's like that water park I worked at, but with better special effects." Instructor Vexar watched in disbelief as Jake turned the disastrous scenario into what appeared to be a one-man acrobatic show. He used the gravity shifts to bounce between walls, caught falling equipment before it could harm the other students, and seemed to be thoroughly enjoying the rain. "Hey, Prof," Jake called out, sliding past while carrying 3 panic-stricken Gelaroids to safety. "You should crank up the oxygen a bit more, really get that party atmosphere going." The Zizik, who had been frozen in terror, began clicking their mandibles in what sounded suspiciously like laughter. The Crystari, rather than dimming in fear, were actually syncing their bioluminescence to Jake's movements, creating an impromptu light show. But the hazards," Instructor Vexar sputtered. "The dangers, the potentially lethal conditions." "Lethal." Jake paused mid-flip, genuine confusion on his face. "Prof, this is literally just like a Tuesday back home, except maybe a bit warmer." He grinned, using a gravity shift to guide a wobbling Crystari to stable ground. Though I got to admit, the variable gravity is a nice touch. Makes it way easier to help everyone out. That's when Instructor Vexar noticed something extraordinary. The alien students weren't panicking anymore. Instead, they were watching Jake with something new in their various sensory organs. Admiration. Even the Gelaroids had shifted to a color that indicated growing confidence. "You know what?" Jake said, helping steady a Zazik who had actually attempted a small jump in the shifting gravity. "Maybe instead of treating everything like it's going to kill us, we could focus on how to adapt. I mean, look at Zix here. They're getting the hang of it." The Zizik clicked proudly, their antennae waving in what might have been enthusiasm. Instructor Vexar looked at his class, really looked at them. Where he had expected to see terror, he saw the beginning of understanding. Where he had planned for panic, he saw the first glimmers of resilience. "Very well, Mr. Drake," he clicked softly. Perhaps you would be interested in a teaching assistant position next semester." Jake's grin could have powered a small star system. "Only if we can make it rain more often." 3 cycles later, Instructor Vexar stood before the Galactic Academy's Curriculum Review Board, nervously adjusting his ceremonial sash as he presented his revised course outline. "Distinguished colleagues," he clicked, mandibles twitching with newfound enthusiasm. "I stand before you to propose a complete overhaul of our survival skills program. Recent experiences have led me to question our fundamental understanding of what constitutes dangerous conditions." The board members shifted uncomfortably as footage from Jake's final exam played on the holographic display. Several gasped as they watched the human casually performing acrobatics in conditions that would have triggered emergency evacuations on most civilized worlds. "As you can see," Instructor Vexar continued, "our classification of Death Worlder may need some revision. Perhaps instead of terrifying planet of doom, we should consider Earth as more of a high-intensity training facility." From the back of the chamber came a familiar laugh. Jake Drake, now sporting an official Academy instructor's badge, reinforced to withstand what he called rough handling, was leaning against the wall with his signature grin. "The new curriculum," Instructor Vexar explained, pulling up another hologram, "will focus less on avoiding challenges and more on adapting to them. For instance, our former lethal atmospheric exposure module has been renamed Introduction to Weather Appreciation." A Bloberian board member rippled questioningly. "Yes," Instructor Vexar nodded. "The rain is optional, though I must admit, the students have shown remarkable enthusiasm for what they now call splash practice." The footage changed to show a recent class where a group of Chiktari, under Jake's guidance, were actually attempting to jump in varying gravity fields. Their clicking laughter was clearly audible, even through their safety fields, which Jake had helped modify to be less restrictive. Furthermore, Instructor Vexar continued, his mandibles twitching with what might have been pride. "Our chemical safety protocols have been updated to include what Mr. Drake calls common sense, rather than blind panic." The board watched in amazement as current students, wearing significantly less safety gear than before, confidently navigated obstacles that would have caused mass fainting just a few cycles ago. In conclusion, Instructor Vexar clicked, standing straighter. "I believe we have been doing our students a disservice by treating every minor challenge as a potential catastrophe. We were teaching fear rather than resilience. Thanks to our unique perspective shift, enrollment in survival courses has increased 300%. He paused, glancing at Jake. "Though I must insist that Mr. Drake stop referring to the Advanced Terrain Navigation course as parkour for beginners." "No promises, Prof," Jake called out cheerfully. The board members huddled together, whispered briefly, then announced their unanimous approval of the curriculum changes. They also approved the immediate expansion of the Human Exchange Student Program, though with one crucial amendment. All future survival instructors would be required to take what became known as the human perspective. Why everything probably won't kill you after all, Jake's only complaint. They still wouldn't let him teach it in the rain.